So I like to explain, and there's Professor Roman, but we have actually lost 4 minutes already. Mr. Roman is actually he's actually quoting Rahaba future design project in his TED talk. He actually introduced what the endeavors of TED, endeavors of Yahaba in TED. And has anybody seen his TED talk? Actually, there is a Japanese subtitle for the his talk, so you can listen to his talk while reading Japanese subtitles, which is a good news. And I've learned a lot from Professor Krznaric, many things. And he is actually practicing what he's majoring, which is philosophy. He's actually the researcher. He's practicing what he knows and has. So up until now, he has accumulated various experiences, and so that we can learn from his experiences. And he has actually written The Good Ancestor recently. It's been published, and it's a very interesting book. But he's going to talk about his book, I think, today. But this book is going to be translated by Mr. Matsumoto into Japanese, so that recently you all have a chance to read his book in Japanese. So I've talked more than 1 minute. So I'd like to hand the baton to Professor Krznaric.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I hope you can all hear me okay. It's a great honor to be speaking to you today. And, you know, let me just tell you to start just a small story that a few years ago, my wife was at a conference in Japan. She's an economist, and she gave me a very excited telephone call. She said, I've just met a man called Professor Saijo, and he's told me about this amazing new method of thinking about the future called future design. And I then went and discovered all about it. And that really excited me, because at the time I was writing my book, The Good Ancestor, all about long-term thinking. And what I discovered in future design is something incredibly inspiring and a very powerful and profound way of connecting with the future and future generations. And it seems to me that this is one of the most important things we need to be doing at this moment in history on a global level, because I think we all know that we live in an age of chronic short-term thinking, that our politicians can hardly see beyond the next election. Our businesses can't see beyond the next quarterly report. Markets spike, then crash in speculative bubbles. Nations sit around international conference tables arguing with each other while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, we are constantly looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the present moment, the tyranny of the now. And I think we all know we need more long-term thinking. In many areas, we need long-term thinking to deal with the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need it to deal with technological risks, like risks from artificial intelligence or bioweapons. We need long-term thinking to deal with social issues like aging populations, of course, a big issue in Japan. And of course, we need long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis, from climate change to biodiversity loss. And I think, though, that there is a problem, which is that there is a conceptual emergency. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of people say, oh, we need more long-term thinking. But how do you actually really do long-term thinking? Are there different kinds of long-term thinking? Is it always good for us? And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. I want to talk about 6 different ways to think long-term, which are in my book, The Good Ancestor. And I want to relate it to future design and show where future design fits into that. But I think the place to really begin, before I talk about these 6 ways to think long-term, is just to begin with a question, which is, sometimes people say to me, oh, you talk a lot about long-term thinking, Roman, but human beings, we're not designed for long-term thinking, people say. You know, we are short-term creatures. We like instant gratification and immediate rewards. And my response is that, well, that is not really an accurate picture of human nature. It's true we're driven by short-term things, but we're also driven by long-term things. I mean, we are constantly have a struggle going on in our own minds between the drivers of short-termism and long-termism. Do we go out and party tonight, or do we save for our pensions for tomorrow? Do we upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And I think of this as a struggle between two parts of the brain, what I call the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. And the marshmallow brain is the part of our neuroanatomy, which focuses on instant rewards and immediate gratification. It's an ancient part of the brain, maybe 80 million years old. We share it with many mammals, such as rats. And the marshmallow brain is named after the famous 1960s psychology test, which you probably know about, called the marshmallow test, where a marshmallow sweet was put on a table in front of children. And if the children could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were given a reward of a second marshmallow. And the research findings showed that the majority of children could not resist, and they ate the marshmallow. And it was apparently evidence of our short-term instant gratification nature. But the marshmallow brain is only part of the story of who we are, because we also have inside our minds, inside our brains, what I call the acorn brain. And this is the part of our brains which focuses on long-term thinking and strategizing and planning. And it's a part of the brain that's better developed in humans than in most other creatures. It's a new part of the brain, only 2 million years old. It lives at the front of the head in a part called the frontal lobe, particularly a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, probably a difficult term for your interpreters to put into Japanese. But the amazing thing about this frontal lobe area is that it's better developed in humans, as I said, than most other animals. So a chimpanzee, for example, can think and plan ahead a little bit. So they might get a stick, take off the leaves, and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of these tools and put them aside for next week. But that's exactly what a human being will do. That's the acorn brain in action. That's how we save for our pensions. That's how we write song lists for our own funerals. That's how we built the Great Wall of China, or the Tokugawa shoguns did their amazing tree planting schemes in the 18th and 19th century. It's how we voyaged into space. So we need to learn how to switch on our acorn brains. This is really the key to long-term thinking. But the question is how to do that. And you should be able to see my screen there that I'm sharing now. And what I want to show you is 6 ways to think long-term from my book, as I mentioned. And in my book, I talk about a tug of war, a struggle for time going on between 6 drivers of short-termism and 6 drivers of long-term thinking. Many of the factors driving short-termism in society are very familiar. Things like digital distraction, how we're always looking at our phones, or political presentism, all those short-term cycles of politics, of all those elections, or speculative capitalism, the ups and downs of finance. Some are probably less familiar, like the tyranny or domination of the clock, the way that over the last 500 years, the invention of the mechanical clock has been speeding up time and eroding the future. You know, the first clocks in Europe used to make a sound or a chime once an hour, but by 1800, most clocks had minute hands. By 1700, they had minute hands. And by 1800, they had second hands. And then in the 19th century, clocks spread everywhere. The pocket watch became very popular in Japan, of course. And now we have nanosecond speed share trading. So clock time has also been part of a cultural factor speeding up time. But these 6 drivers of short-termism are matched by 6 ways to think long-term. And I want to talk about these 6 ways to think long-term from my book, The Good Ancestor. Now, the first one I want to talk about is the idea of a legacy mindset. This is about being remembered well by future generations. Now, the way I think about this is to consider something that is probably familiar from utilitarian philosophy about weighing up how many people there are today compared to those in the future, our connection with them. If you think about it, there are 7.7 billion people alive today, the living. Now, over the past 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But over the next 50,000 years, an estimated nearly 7 trillion people will be born, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize in the 21st century. And in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. Amongst them, all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and all the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And there's a real question there of, well, what legacy are we going to leave for all those generations to come? And someone who really thought about this issue a lot was the famous immunologist Jonas Salk, who in the 1950s developed the world's first polio vaccine. And in later life, he said, the great question facing humanity is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, are we going to be remembered well by those generations to come? And of course, many cultures think a lot about their ancestors. Of course, you know, Japan famously has a long traditions of honoring and venerating ancestors, looking into the past. But how often do we really think about the fact that we will be ancestors, how we're going to be remembered by all those generations in the future? And it can be quite difficult to think about this, but let me offer you a little thought experiment. I'd like you just to imagine in your own mind a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or one of your own children or grandchildren. And just think for a moment of the kind of life they might lead in the decades to come and what that world might be like. Imagine what year they might eventually live to and all the struggles and the ups and downs that they may face. Now, I can stop and think about my own daughter who's 12 years old. She could be alive in the year 2100. And so could be the young person that you might be thinking about now. Now that future, 2100, is not science fiction. It's an intimate family fact, you know, just a couple of steps away from our own lives. And I think, you know, certainly when I think about my daughter, who could be, you know, 92 years old in the year 2100, I think about her world. It could be a world of utopia and great pleasures. It could be a world of high risks, a world on fire affected by the climate crisis. But whatever world she lives in, when I think about it, I realize that she is not alone. She is embedded in a web of human relationships, the communities that support her and family, but she is also part of the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So if I care about the legacy that I leave for her life, I need to think about all life, you know, so that whole world that she lives in, I can't just care about her. I need to care about something bigger than that. And so I think what's really interesting here is that considering your own family, someone from your family like a nephew or niece or child or grandchild, is like a stepping stone or a bridge to something more transcendent, about caring about the universal strangers of the future, which is what being a good ancestor is all about. And there's some really wonderful projects around the world that try and help us with this kind of legacy thinking about what gifts we might leave to the generations to come. One that I really love is created by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson. It's a 100-year art project called Future Library, where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is leaving a book which will remain in secret in the Future Library until the year 2100, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees that have been planted in a forest outside Oslo in Norway. Many famous writers have donated books, like the Canadian author Margaret Atwood or the Korean novelist Han Kang, who you can see in the image there. But just think that Han Kang or Margaret Atwood will never meet the readers of their books. They will never see their books printed in their lifetime. So this is like a gift to future generations, a legacy gift. And we can all ask ourselves what legacies we want to leave to the generations to come. Now, that's the first kind of long-term thinking. Now, the second kind, apart from legacy mindset, is cathedral thinking. This is the idea of embarking on projects with very long time horizons, maybe decades or centuries into the future. It's named after the famous medieval cathedral builders, church builders in Europe in the Middle Ages, who would start building their churches knowing they would maybe never be finished in their own lifetimes. I mean, the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has said we need cathedral thinking to tackle the climate crisis. And this cathedral thinking comes in many different forms. In the image there in the top left-hand side, you can see a church in Germany called Almminster, which was begun in the year 1377. Well, it wasn't finished until 1890, more than 500 years later. This is incredibly kind of long-term thinking project. So that's the kind of cathedral thinking, building religious buildings. On the right-hand side, you can see an image from England in the 19th century, the building of London's sewage system. And this was a really famous example of cathedral thinking because in 1858, there was a great crisis because raw sewage was being dumped in the River Thames, and the tens of thousands of people were dying each year from diseases like cholera. The smell was so bad it went into the Parliament building, and members of Parliament passed emergency legislation to build the sewers. And the chief engineer of the sewers, called Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who's standing at the top wearing the big hat, he decided to build the sewers twice as big as they needed to be. And that's why those sewers are still used today. This was long-term cathedral thinking. He also built them out of very expensive bricks. So this is really about building resilience into a public works project. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the civil rights movement in the United States. And I give that example because this is also a kind of cathedral thinking, long-term social struggles for rights, civil rights, women's rights, indigenous rights. They don't succeed in weeks or months or even years. Sometimes they take decades or even longer. A lot of social struggles take half a century. They need long-term cathedral thinking. And one other example here is from the science world. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, where millions of seeds are being collected in an indestructible rock bunker inside a mountain in the Arctic Circle that has been designed to last for 1,000 years. That is very long-term cathedral thinking as well. And of course, in Japan, there are so many really inspiring examples of this long-term cathedral thinking. Here's one which will be familiar to you, I'm sure. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see the Fukushima nuclear plant, which, caught fire and went into meltdown in 2011, of course, after the tsunami. But on the left-hand side, as you probably know, is the Onagawa nuclear plant, which survived the tsunami. Now, why did it survive? Well, it survived because the chief engineer in the 1970s, a man named Yanosuke Hirai, and I'm sure I said that with very bad pronunciation, Yanosuke Hirai, he decided that in building the Onagawa plant, he was going to put the wall 15 meters high, higher than was needed by the regulations. And then he put the nuclear plant itself another 15 meters high. So he built it much higher than everybody said he should. And the reason he did this, apparently, was because he knew that in the 9th century, more than 1,000 years ago, a shrine about 7 kilometers inland had been destroyed by a tsunami. He knew another tsunami could come. This was incredible long-term thinking, cathedral thinking. And as I'm sure you know, during the tsunami, local people found shelter in the Onagawa nuclear plant, very different from Fukushima. So this is really amazing. I think it shows the capacity of human beings to think long-term, to use our acorn brains. But let me say that cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. It can be put to very narrow and self-serving ends. Think about the political regime in North Korea. They want to preserve power from family generation to family generation. That's a kind of long-term cathedral thinking. Or think about in the corporate world, a former head of the investment bank, Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." And I think that's a very narrow and self-centered, egoistic form of long-termism or cathedral thinking. And I think we need to think more broadly than that, wider than that, if we're really going to care about future generations. We need to combine cathedral thinking and legacy mindset with a third form of long-term thinking, which is intergenerational justice. This is about our responsibilities, our moral and political obligations to the generations of the future. And personally, I have a confession to make. I used to be a political scientist many years ago, teaching in universities, and I was apparently an expert on democracy. And during that time, it never once occurred to me that we systematically fail to give political voice or representation to future generations in the same way that historically we've ignored the voices of women or slaves. Yet that is the reality. Never before, in a way, have our actions had such potential consequences for future generations. We need to find ways to bring their voices into our political decision-making. How do we do this? Well, I'm very inspired by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision-making. And here is a wonderful quote from Chief Oren Lyons from the Iroquois peoples of Native American peoples. He says this, he says, "We are looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure that every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" And I love that vision. It's a vision of ecological care or stewardship going on into the future. And around the world, there are many movements and organizations which have been inspired by seventh generation thinking. So one example I really like is a legal movement in the United States called Our Children's Trust, which has filed a landmark legal case against the United States federal government on behalf of the 21 young people you can see there who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. So this is about doing something extraordinary in terms of constitutional rights, giving rights to people who may not be born for decades. They're directly inspired by the seventh generation idea. And of course, there are other legal struggles to give legal personhood to nature, to give rights to rivers or mountains, like in New Zealand, the Wanganui River, which is sacred to local Maori people, has been given the legal rights the same as a person to help protect it. So here's one organization inspired by Native American seventh generation thinking. But here's another one that you know about, of course, which is future design. This photo you'll know is from Yahaba. And of course, future design is partly inspired by that Native American idea. And I think one of the reasons future design is so powerful is partly it's drawing on this indigenous wisdom, but it's making it work in a modern society, of course, in towns like Yahaba and bigger cities like Matsumoto and Uchi. And it's been wonderful to see over the last few years how future design has spread. And one of the things I think that makes it so powerful and the reason it inspires people around the world is that it is partly about, I think, regenerating democracy. I think there's a declining faith in democracy, particularly in the Western world. The idea that our political parties can't deal with the problems we're facing, whether it's climate change or dealing with aging populations or investment in housing or dealing with COVID-19. But future design shows that when you ask local people in cities and towns to talk about the issues of their lives and that might affect their children or children's children, they tend to have a much longer term vision than many elected politicians. And I think this is really wonderful. And so I would love to see future design spreading even further, being used increasingly by central government in decision-making and planning, being used by corporations, and of course, spreading around the world. And I'm sure that it's going to do that. I mean, and it is already starting to do that. There are national health trusts in the UK that want to be using the future design method. I'd love to see it used in meetings of the G20 or the COP26 climate negotiations. But I also like the way that future design, in a way, in the spirit of imagining into the future. And of course, future design is all about using our acorn brains. And of course, it's about intergenerational justice, but also about the legacies we want to leave. But it's also inspiring people around the world to rethink and reimagine the future. I've been talking about future design with the head of a renewable energy company in the UK, in the United Kingdom, called Good Energy. They do solar panels and wind power. And partly inspired by future design and other seventh generation thinking and things like that, they have started something new, which is they have their normal board of the company, but now they've just set up a children's board where children will come along and discuss what the future of the company should be. So this is really also in the spirit of future design. It's about reimagining the future for the long term. I hope that those children dress up in the happy gowns that are often worn in future design meetings. So this is, intergenerational justice, and future design, I think, is leading the world in this area. And it's very, very important example of being a good ancestor. Let me now say something about a fourth form of long-term thinking, holistic forecasting. This is the idea of making predictions about the future. Now, of course, companies have been doing this for years. They predict what their market share will be, or when the oil may run out if they're a petroleum company. But I think we need to start thinking about forecasting in a very long-term way, holistic, whole forecasting, meaning thinking about the prospects for our civilization as a whole. And I think one of the great revolutions in recent forecasting came in the 1990s when climate scientists started predicting what might be the state of the world in 100 years or even 500 years, what might happen to atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, or what might happen to sea level rises. The image you can see there is from a recent 2019 paper on new predictions for sea level rises around the world and the number of people whose homes will be underwater. You can see, of course, very bad effects in China, in Japan, in parts of Brazil, Bangladesh, and other places in India as well. So this is about long-term thinking, holistic forecasting. But we should think even longer than that. There's a very important study done of the rise and fall of ancient civilizations from a Cambridge University scholar called Luke Kemp. He measured the length of how long does a civilization last in the ancient world. He looked at nearly 90 of them, including the Roman Empire and the Mayans in Central America, and found that the average age of a civilization was 336 years. Not very long. Of course, it tells us that civilizations rise and fall, and we must recognize that our own global capitalist civilization may not last forever. So we need to think about how do we jump onto a different pathway. And that takes me to a fifth form of long-term thinking, the idea of a transcendent goal, a universal goal for our species. Because, look, you can do long-term thinking as a company, as a university, as a local government, but we need to think about what are we aiming to achieve? What is the ultimate ambition or objective? Now, I think in the last few decades, three main goals for humankind have emerged. The dominant one is, you can see on the left-hand side there, the idea of perpetual progress, the idea that we need to just keep growing our economies and having material improvement, keeping the curve going ever upwards, upwards, upwards. But we know that we can no longer continue doing this. The idea of continuous economic growth is a mythology of the 20th century. Nothing in nature grows forever, whether it's the Amazon rainforest or your children's feet. Who are we to think that our economies can keep growing at 2 or 3% year after year without having devastating effects? We already know we're using on average 1.6 planet Earths every year in terms of our ecological footprint. That cannot be a sustainable long-term goal for humanity. So are there other options? Well, a second option is the idea of what I call techno-liberation, the idea that technology can solve all our problems. People like Elon Musk says, oh, the great goal for humankind must be to colonize other worlds. Let's go to Mars. That's the future of humankind. But the problem with going to Mars is not only is it going to be very difficult to set up colonies on Mars and create an atmosphere, it might take thousands of years to do it. One of the bigger problems in a way is the collateral damage, because the more focus we put on trying to say that our destiny is going into the stars or to Mars, the less we're going to look after planet Earth, the one planet we know that sustains life. So I think that the ultimate goal should be what I call one planet thriving, which means meeting the needs of all current and future people within the means of a flourishing planet. When you think about it, you know, if you're a mountaineer, a mountain climber, you don't go up a very difficult mountain until your base camp is in order and your supplies are in order. And the thing is, we haven't yet learned to look after base camp planet Earth yet. We're not ready to go to Mars. Once we've learned to live within the ecological boundaries of planet Earth, then yes, let's go to Mars. But until then, we need to learn to live within the boundaries of the planet. This is the basis of ecological economics, which I was never taught when I studied economics at university. I was just shown a demand and supply diagram or a circular flow of income diagram with no circle around it, which I needed that circle. We need that circle. That circle is the biosphere. So we need to learn to live within planetary boundaries over the long term. This is how other species have survived and thrived for 10,000 generations or more, whether they are bears or beavers or birds, by living within the boundaries of the ecosystem in which they are embedded, by not fouling or destroying their nest, by caring for the place that will take care of their offspring, which is what human beings don't do because we are so good at destroying the place, the living world that will look after our offspring. But in order to do this one planet thriving as a goal, I think we need new economic models. We need to get off the idea of continuous economic growth as our goal. And the model that I really like, I think is very powerful, is the British economist Kate Raworth's model of the donut economy, or the donut of social and planetary boundaries. Some of you may know this model. On the inside is what's called the social foundation. And the idea is to bring people above a basic foundation, basic needs and rights, things like water, food, and healthcare. And that inner circle is based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time as bringing people above a social foundation, we need to stay within the outer circle, the ecological ceiling, which are made up of the 9 planetary boundaries developed by Earth system scientists, things like climate change and ocean acidification and biodiversity loss. So we need to get into the light green space between the social foundation and ecological ceiling. This is an economic model which is not about constant growth, growth, growth. It's about thriving in balance in that safe and just space for humanity, the light green area. But there's a question, well, where are we as a global civilization when it comes to the donut model? Well, here is an image of it. The bigger the red on the inside is the bigger the shortfall. So the big red segments show that we are failing to provide basic water, food, healthcare for people around the world. And on the outer layer, we are overshooting or going over at least 4 of the planetary boundaries for which we have good data so far. And there are also national donut models too. And if you look at the one for Japan, you can see that while Japan meets many of social foundations for people, it overshoots the ecological ceiling on a huge scale. And something I would love to see in terms of future design is for future design to also sometimes experiment with working with this donut model, to get people to imagine from the year 2060 to look back and advise us today how we might act, what policies we might need for a city in Japan or a region in Japan or the country as a whole to get into that donut-shaped space. Now, a final kind of long-term thinking is the idea of deep time humility, recognizing that humankind is just a short eye blink in the long cosmic story. Now, it's quite hard to think about what this really means, but if you imagine that the age of the Earth is the distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file on your middle finger erases human history. That's how short we've been here for. Just a couple of 100,000 years, our species. And in fact, in the last 200 years, we have created such damage, ecological damage, technological damage. And I think that really raises a question: who are we to create such destruction of the living world and of our ecosystems which support life and all those future generations? Who are we to have broken this great chain of life? And I think this is what a sense of deep time can give us, that that time's gone on and life's gone on so far in the past, will go on so long into the future. And we have an obligation to, in a way, continue the journey of life itself to get that bigger perspective. How can we do that in everyday life? It's quite difficult. One of the ways I try and connect with deep time is by visiting ancient trees. Now, here's a wonderful ancient tree I've discovered in Japan, which is a Japanese cedar tree on Yukushima. This tree is certainly at least 2,000 years old. It may be, in fact, more than 7,000 years old. And maybe where you live, you can go and visit an ancient tree to connect with those longer cycles of nature. And this is something I do with my kids. I cycle with them and visit a 1,000-year-old yew tree about just a few minutes from my house. So these are ways we can connect with the 6 different forms of long-term thinking. We need to use this mental toolkit. And I think future design is a really important way of doing this. But we also must do something else. We must hold our governments to account for long-term public policy. We must ensure that our governments take the long view, because you can have all the sustainable development goals that you like, but if your political decision making and your public policy is short term, you're not going to make much progress. And in my book, The Good Ancestor, I show a new index called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which measures public policy performance. It puts together 10 different indicators from environmental, social, and economic fields. So renewable energy and deforestation, wealth inequality, long-term investment in healthcare. It ranks 122 countries. You can see the highest scoring countries on the right-hand side there, like Iceland, Sweden, many non-OECD countries like Nepal or Uruguay. But where's Japan? You know, in fact, Japan is ranked only number 37 on this list. So Japan as a nation has a long way to go to climb up that list of intergenerational solidarity, public policy for future generations. Let me finish by really raising the ultimate struggle that we're facing, that human time horizons stretch from, sometimes we think and live on a scale of seconds and minutes. We're clicking the buy now button. We're watching 24/7 news. The stock market goes up and down. But I think if we're going to be good ancestors, we really need to start thinking more on the scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. Too much of our lives are now spent in those short-term areas of seconds and minutes. And I think the challenge we face now is to put our acorn brains into action. And I think the good news ultimately is that there are methods and movements like future design, which are at the forefront, which are pioneering long-term thinking. And the more that the world can learn from future design, I think the better. And I think, so many of you listening here, I'm sure, are deeply engaged with future design, and the work you're doing is extremely important as a model, not just within Japan, but for the rest of the world, so that we all have the opportunity to become good ancestors. And with that, I'd like to stop. Thank you very much for listening.